Come join us as we explore what it means to be the church and study God's purpose and intention for us as the body of Christ in this place.
I think it's true to say for us that just about all of us can be said to have something we're really good at. You know, there's something that you do that stands out above a lot of other people, and it could be something big, it could be something small. Maybe you're really good at gardening. I know a few people who are really good at gardening here who really stand out. Maybe it's something at work that you do really well, and your coworkers sort of know you're the guy to go to for this problem or this situation. Maybe it's sports. Perhaps you're like really good at basketball or something like that. But most people have something that they're really good at. So the other night I was thinking about that, and I asked Chantel, my love, my dear, what am I good at? You know, what's one thing, if you think about me, that you would say, you know, I'm good at? You know, I didn't know what I was expecting, you know. Could it be the looks? Could it be, you know, the way I talk? Could it be my handling of a crisis? Her response initially was, I got to think about that. So that's first problem. And then her answer to me was, hey, you know what you're really good at? You're really good at school. And I was like, wait, I'm a 35-year-old man, and the one thing I'm good at is school. Oh, that's going to get me far, isn't it? So that was something, but hey, I am good at it. So I got something. We all have something we're good at, but there is something that we are all really good at. So there's something that we are all pretty much pros at. Problem is, this something is we are all really good at making idols. See, whatever you think is really good that you're really good at, I'm going to tell you, you're probably even better at idol making here. And that's not a good thing. That's actually not a good thing that we're all good at. If you remember the passage in Isaiah we covered a couple weeks ago, we mentioned it. Isaiah's looking at this people who are involved with all their idols, and he talks about how they are. This man, he goes into the forest, he cuts down a tree, you know, and he takes the wood with it, and half the wood, he makes a fire, and he says, the fire. And then he cooks his meat on it, and he enjoys it, and it's good. And the other half of the wood, he takes time, he fashions it, he makes an image of a man or a creature, he sets it up, and he bows down to this thing and says, oh, you are my God, save me. And that's how idols work. But no matter how good that man was at making an idol out of that piece of wood, we are at least as good in our own lives making idols for us to follow after. Well, Paul's discussing that today, because the truth is, if we want Christ to be alive and active in our life, if we want to see him at work, what we really need to do is realize how much of a challenge that is for us, that we're so good at making idols, and we need to break those idols. We need to find a way to break them and get away from those idols. And we see this, that if we don't do that, if we choose not to, if we continue on either saying, you know, that's not a problem for me, or, you know, I don't actually mind it as a problem, what that will do for you individually is take you away from God. You're going to notice a distance between you and God as you place things between you and him. And as a church, if we allow that as a church, in our life as a church, for these idols to be there, what that's going to mean is we're not going to be effective in the ministry that God has called us to. Because having idols like that will take us away from it. And the thing is, people will notice it. You know, people who look into our lives, we don't always know all the idols we keep. But people who look into your lives can look at it and say, hey, this is what you idolize. What do you spend your time on? If I walk into your house, what do I see that really takes the prime space there? What takes up most of the time? Even coming into a church, sometimes we can't see all the idols we might have, but a person looking in can tell. You know, you guys really care more about this than you care about Christ. You put this before the mission he's given you. And Paul knows this. Paul sees this in Corinth, as he's seen in other churches. And so we get to a point now in 1 Corinthians where he begins to address that. So if you're not there yet, turn with me. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 22. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 22, what Pat just read for us. Because as we get here, if you've been with us the past couple weeks, you know, Paul's been talking about rights. He's been talking about rights and giving up rights and the struggle that can be. It's no accident that we're dealing with idols immediately after that. In fact, this is all part of the argument for Paul that he's making. Because, you know, those rights, those good things in our life, and rights are good. Many other things are good in our lives, but idols always start out as good things. Idols start out as good things. If they weren't good, if they weren't something that attracted us to them, if there wasn't some need that they in some way filled, we wouldn't run to them. Yeah, but sadly, good things can become idols. Good things often become idols in our lives. Paul wants the Corinthians to see that. And we need to see that as well. And so today what we're looking at, just 2 points here in this argument Paul is making, is how do you make idols and how do you break idols? First, how do you make idols? And second, how do you break them? And he begins by driving it home how you make idols. So he begins that part. How do you make idols? You make idols by putting your trust anywhere outside of God. Putting your trust in anything other than God will start making idols for you. Now, of course, the response that might be natural to that, especially for us good Christian folk, is, no way, we don't put idols in our life. You can go to our home and you can see we don't have any images of any Asherah poles, any images of Baal. We don't put idols in our life. We have one God and one God alone. And we might say amen to that, but what Paul is showing in these verses here, he's exposing some of the truth for the Corinthians, that they are, in their hearts, idol makers. They make idols. And they might try to hide them, like we might try to hide them, but the truth is most of us, we have idols. We might even have idols active in our life right now. I've had to wrestle with that this week. What have I put in that place, God? Because I've dealt with idols. It's easy to get them. So Paul, in a very direct way, especially for this people, drives this home by looking at a really painful moment in what you would call the history of redemption, in the history of God working with his people. Because we look back to the Exodus here, the Exodus. And truly, as we look at it, you might say this was the best of times. The best of times to be a follower of Christ, or a follower of God in this case. Because think about the Israelites. So we've got to take a step back. If you've ever read the book of Exodus or you heard the Bible stories, you know that the people of God were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. They were slaves in Egypt for 400 years, and then God called them out of Egypt. He brought them out using all these miracles and wonders. In fact, going through the process, he essentially took all the Egyptian gods to court, and in 10 plagues said, "You're not God, I am. You're not a God, I am." To all these different gods of Egypt, proving that he is the one true God. And then he took them out through a sea that was parted, under a cloud of his glory and a pillar of fire at night. So if you're thinking of any people in history, and you could say they saw God and should be able to follow him, you might say it'd be those Israelites. They had everything going for them. And that's what Paul says here. Paul agrees with that. So if we see what he's writing here in verse 1, he says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers." In other words, pay attention, pay close attention here, "that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ." What's Paul saying? They had every spiritual blessing. I mean, listen to the blessing they had. They had a baptism. They literally went through the sea as it was parted. And under this cloud that was God's glory watching over them. They had that. But it wasn't just that. We have a baptism. We know what that's like, right? They also ate spiritual food. They had their own table that they came to. They ate spiritual food and they had the living water coming from, as Paul says right here, from Christ himself. Christ was active there in the Exodus, providing for them. They had every spiritual blessing. Well, that gives us an image of ourselves, too, because we have every spiritual blessing. The images that Paul uses here are images that are supposed to rise something in us to say, wait, we have those too. We might not have went through a sea, but we've been through baptism. God has taken us out of the slavery of our sin and into a new life. We have this table to gather at, communion with God. We have Jesus Christ, the very living water. In fact, we often find ourselves I have found myself reading this story saying, Israelites, why couldn't you get it? You saw everything in front of you, but you still didn't get it. And we just wonder at them. How could you do that? Paul's pulling something out here, though. All those things that the Israelites had, you have. And in fact, not only do you have them even more. Because on top of just a simple baptism and a communion, you have the very life of Christ alive and active in you. So if you struggle in any degree with what God has revealed to you, as far as what your life with him is, well, then you would have struggled even more had you been back there with those Israelites. You would have struggled as well. And the truth is, they did struggle. How did they struggle? Well, Paul says here, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. With most of them, God was not pleased. That is one of the great understatements of history. Because with some of them, he was not pleased. How many of them was he actually pleased with? Anybody know the count? How many? Anyone? Well, you can answer. What was that? Two out of what some estimate to be about 2.4 million. 2 people he was pleased with. That was Caleb and Joshua, got the chance to go into the promised land. Everybody else died in the wilderness. Even Moses. At the end there, Moses, he struck that rock in anger, and said, here's your water, Israelite, have it. And God said, no, that took glory from me. You're not going to the promised land now, Moses. And he died on a mountain looking into the promised land. Only 2 in the end found favor. The rest fell short. I was actually doing the math and thinking about that. All right, so if we were similar to them in that sense, as far as who makes it to the promised land in this life and who stays in the wilderness, we would need a church about 15,000 times our size to have the hope of one, as far as the count goes. So when he says he was not pleased with most of them, yeah, most of them he was not pleased with. You might want to ask the question, why? Why wasn't he pleased with them? What caused him to stay in the wilderness like that? Well, Paul tells us right here. Verse 14, if we hop on down a little bit, we see exactly why. Because they made idols. He's a little therefore there, is why we're jumping ahead a few verses. But he says, therefore, in verse 14, my beloved, flee from idolatry. All these things that I'm talking about, all this history of Israel that I just gave you, the purpose is so that you would flee from idolatry. Why did those people end up in the wilderness? It was because of the idolatry that was in their heart. And so Paul is giving this, as he says in verse 6, this is an example for us because we have that same danger of idolatry in our own life. So that's the heart of what Paul is teaching here, that we need to flee from idolatry. We have to stay away from it, or we will lose that blessing. How did the Israelites fall into idolatry? How did they do it? Paul gives us 3 ways that we see here how they fell into idolatry. 3 ways that they gave into an idolatrous heart and turned away from God. The first one he gives us here is in verse 7. Verse 7 he says this, do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, you might read that and think, well, that doesn't sound so bad, does it? Sit down and eat and drink, rise up and play. Nothing bad going on there. But Paul is using their knowledge of history here. That was an event that happened. That event that Paul is referring to is the event of the golden calf. So if you recall that story, they had gone through all these wonders getting out of Egypt. And God had taken them out into the wilderness to Mount Sinai. And Moses went up to the top of the mountain and was there with God in glory, while everybody else was down at the bottom of the mountain. And they waited a few days, didn't know what was going on, so they turned to Aaron, Moses' brother, who was in charge, said, Aaron, where's Moses? Is he dead or something? We don't even know where Moses is. Aaron, we need a god. Make us a god that we can worship. And Aaron, being Aaron in this story, as usual, he looked at them and said, okay, well, give me your earrings. He took everybody's earrings of gold, Egyptian gold, and he made with that gold this calf. And he put this calf up, and everybody celebrated it with this festival. Of course, Moses came down the mountain a little bit later, saw what was going on as they were sitting down to eat and drink, getting up to play. And he said, Aaron, what did you do? Of course, Aaron, great blame shifter, says to Moses, me, I did nothing. They wanted a god. I took some gold, threw it in a furnace, and out came a calf. That's it, God. That's it, Moses. I didn't do anything. but he led them astray into sin, and many of them died for that. What they were doing, though, what they were actually doing in that, is that they were play acting like the world. God was up there with Moses, far away, and that was just too big for them to think. So they decided to go back to what they knew, and they made their own God out of things of the world and celebrated it in a festival just like they would have in Egypt. They just ran right back to the world. They ran after the things of the world. So first way to make an idol is really simple. Just fashion it from the world around you. Just fashion it from the world around you like the world does. Make an idol copying the world. That one's an easy one for us to do. All we got to do is, what does the world chase for? Look at that and go after that. Make that the focus of your life. Is it money? Go for it. Is it entertainment? Run after it. Is it sports? Have at it. What does the world idolize? What does it put up there? Make that part of your life. That's what the Israelites were doing there in the desert, and that's a way that we can do it as well. I've always been a little bit shocked how often the idea of idolatry comes up even in a positive sense in our culture. I remember one of my favorite shows when I was young was a show called Liberty Kids. Anyone ever see Liberty Kids? Am I the only one? My daughter does because we have the DVDs. But in Liberty Kids, great show giving the story of the American Revolution and these kids who join with these, great fathers of the country. And yes, you see Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, all the greats. And it sort of gives you the history going through. But in the song that starts it, there was one line that always caught me. And the line was this in the song: I'm looking for a hero to idolize. And they had a big picture of George Washington, as they're saying that. Because it's so easy to be like the world and make idols out of things, even heroes, even people like George Washington. Make that an idol to say, oh, that's what I want my life to be like. I want to be just like that. In fact, this is a person who I'm going to dedicate my life to. And that's what they were doing. I was also thinking when I was young, American Idol popped up. Anybody see American Idol? Yeah, some people seen American Idol. Isn't that great that we just put that sin right in the title, American Idol? Because that's an image of what America wants: fame and money and fortune. And so, of course, we put that in front of ourselves because that's an idol for us to chase after. An idol to take something, take that place in our hearts. It's so easy for us to take on those idols because it's natural. And the world is geared towards that. But that's just one way. That's just one way. That's an active way. Just blatantly making an idol out of the stuff that the world has as an idol. There's another way that he talks about here, though, too. Remember, all this is under the ideal of idolatry that Paul is talking about. But the second way he gives here is in verse 8. Verse 8, he says this: we must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. Okay. First off, yeah, definitely sexual morality we need to stay away from. But he's talking about this in a context of idolatry here as well. So what is the story that he's mentioning here? Well, he says 23,000 fell in one day, and that happened in a case of sexual morality that we find in Numbers chapter 25. So Numbers chapter 25, we hear sort of the end result of the story of Balaam and Balak. Now, that's a great story. I don't know if any of you know Balaam, but you might know his talking donkey. Everybody remembers that story from, Sunday school. But Balaam was a guy who they called him a seer. He could commune with God, or at least get messages from God. And he lived there near Canaan as the Israelites were coming on up through. And there was a king by the name of Balak. Balak saw these Israelites coming and knew he could never stand against this people. There's no way he could stand against them. There were too many, too powerful. So he ran to Balaam and said, Balaam, I'm going to pay you money if you come with me and curse those Israelites. And Balaam said, I can't do that. God's blessed them. But Balak kept adding money, and eventually God was like, okay, Balaam, you can go, but you can only say what I tell you to say. So Balaam said, okay, let's go. That's when he got up and went. He had the incident with the donkey. You can read about that in Numbers as well. But then he makes it to the Israelites, and he's standing up there, and the Israelites are down there in the valley, and Balak is telling him, okay, curse them now. And Balaam starts to try and curse them, and instead he blesses the Israelites. This happens 3 times. He goes to curse, but instead he blesses. And Balak gets angry, and he tries again. 3 times blesses the Israelites. But then, sort of as a consolation for the failure to curse, Balaam goes to Balak and says, I can't curse them because they are protected by God. They have God's protection over them. But I know how you can get rid of that protection. Here's what you do, Balak. You take your young ladies, you send them down into camp, you have them go in there, and the young Israelite men are going to see it, they're going to want to marry them, and they're going to start following your gods. When they do that, that protection is going to go away. And sure enough, that's what happens. The Midianite women go on down, spend some time there with the young men. Those young men start following the gods of Midian. And in the case of Numbers, actually listed as 24,000, including some more who were killed by the Levites at that time. About 24,000 people ended up dying because of that event. See, that's what happened. The people had stopped trusting God to meet this need. That was a legitimate need they had, and they weren't going to where God had told them to go. They weren't pushing forward. So when the world caught up to them, they let the world catch them. So a second way, as Paul's pointing out in this example here, is that if you want to, second way to make a good idol is just stay where you are so the world can catch up with you. This one's a little more passive, but if you stop seeking God and allow yourself to be caught with the enchantments of the world, you're going to find a replacement for him. You're going to find a replacement for him. You don't even need to go out and try and build your own idol. An idol will be provided for you if you stop chasing God. Balaam knew that. So Balaam told Balak to do this tactic, and it made the people ineffective. Because if they went into battle like that, they weren't going to win. They were not going to do the work that God had called them to do as long as they had those foreign idols in their lives. Well, the last one can be a little more concerning than the other two. At least we can say sometimes we're not going out and always building idols out of things of the world, no matter how easy it is. And hopefully many of us can say, we're not just, not chasing after God. You're not going after God, allowing the world to catch up to us. But a lot of us can struggle with this one because it unveils an idolatrous heart in us when we grumble and when we complain. So verses 9 and 10 here, Paul says this, we must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. He's bringing up now two more historical situations for these Israelites when they complained. They complained because in their heart, their idolatrous heart, they looked at what God provided and said, you know what, I want more. That's not good enough for me, God. You're not fulfilling me the way I want to be fulfilled. In fact, I want Egypt again. I want to go back to Egypt. The examples that he's using here, this was with the snakes. When the people started to complain with God that God had just brought them into the wilderness to die. God, why'd you bring us out here? We could have died in Egypt just fine. Over there we had the food we liked. We had the drink we liked. We would have been fine over there in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. But they complained to God that, God just wanted them to die. So what did God do? God sent serpents among them, and they started to die. Until God told Moses, build this staff with this bronze snake. Set it up, and everyone who looks at that snake will be healed. Well, the second one there, the destroyer, that could have been several times, but we know they complained a lot. The Israelites, they looked at this manna coming down from heaven. There's bread from heaven. And they started complaining about it. Like, God, couldn't we have more than this? I mean, sure, it tastes like honey and coriander, and it's amazing, and you provide it free of charge, and it's everywhere. But God, we'd like to spice up our diet a little bit. We like our onions and our garlic that we used to get in Egypt, God. Your food's not as good. They started whining about that, about wanting to go back to Egypt and get that food. They cried out for meat. They said, God, we want meat. You just give us bread. And God took care of that for them. But they kept looking for what is better, at least in their own eyes, rather than what God was giving. So third way, if you want to make an idol well, is to reject what God provides for you. Because a sure way to make an idol is to simply move God out of his spot. Say, God, honestly, I don't want this. I don't want what you provide. I want something else. Reject his goodness, and you will seek out another. And whatever that is, it will become your God. That will become your God. So each of these exposes an idolatrous heart. These are attempts to find something other than God to sort of fill that need. And the result was God was not pleased with most of them. and they did not enter the promised land. Now, when we talk about the promised land and them entering or not entering the promised land, it's not like they lost their salvation out there in the desert. It wasn't like only 2 of them were saved. It wasn't like Moses was condemned because of his own thing before God, because they're not saved in that way. They're saved in their faith in what God was doing. But they did not live the life of promise they were meant to live. They were meant to live in the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and instead they lived out their days in a desert. Under the care of God, God still loved them, but they lived in a desert rather than living in a land of plenty. So they didn't get to live that. So how do we make idols? How do we fall into that trap? We do it the same way. We make idols. We make them of the world. We settle down. We stop chasing after God, and we let the world just catch up to us, and we reject God and what He gives us, what He provides for us. See, and we make these idols of ours out of very good things. Things like food, drink, sex, advancement, things that by their nature may be good, but we build idols out of them and put them in the place that only God should have, and we place them in our hearts. Because idols, they sort of exist to sort of numb that desire that only God can fulfill. So when you turn to anything other than God for fulfillment, it is an idol. Now, of course, our response, a response of many, and I know myself at times, is this: certainly not God, certainly not me. I wouldn't do that. I serve you. I don't make idols. I accept what you give me. Lord, that's not me. You must be talking to that person sitting next to me. But Paul says this here in verse 12. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stand take heed lest he fall. Remember, these Israelites, they had every blessing. They had everything to think that they would do well. They probably thought they were doing pretty well. They thought they were justified in what they were doing and making these idols. Paul has to remind us that no matter how good we think we are, how far progressed we think we are still in danger. It's like, going to the edge of a cliff. You look down, you see everyone down there, and it's like, oh, look at all of them who can't do it. Yeah, but I can do it. Look at me, I can. And then, of course, that's when you fall, even if you're up at the top. So, take heed lest you fall. So what do? How do we break these idols? Well, God shows us how. Paul here demonstrates himself. How do we break idols? By returning our trust to God in everything. Now, if we come to grips with this and we understand what that means, we will look at that and we will see that's impossible. That's insurmountable. Because it's supposed to be. It's not something you can do in your own strength. You are going to be drawn to those idols, but God provides us a way out. He sort of gives 4 steps here. At least I break it down in 4 steps. It might not be exhaustive here, but Paul shows us this. Again, with verse 12, the first step to do is this: take heed. Take heed. Don't put yourself above it. Don't think that you are above making idols in your life, because when you do that is when you're ready to fall. I have learned this lesson time and time again in my life. When I finally think I've made it, there's something in my life that I've conquered and I've got, I finally made it, and I get to that spot of saying, I did it! It's usually when I'm about ready to go into a free fall. It's right about when I fall over the edge, when I think I have made it, because we are only there by the grace of God. It is not us who can do it. So take heed lest you fall. Don't put yourself above it. And don't put the church above it either. Don't put this church above it. We will struggle with our golden calves too. If we think that we've made it, if we think that we have it all together, that this is the church and we're done and we're perfect and we're just trying to catch up with it, no, don't get puffed up like that. Take heed lest you fall. It's the first way. Second, look for the way out. Verse 13 here, Paul says this: no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with temptation He will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. God provides a way out. He does. And you can ask Him for it. He will show you, and you can take it. Meaning you can never sit there and say, devil made me do it. Just my personality, I can't change it. No, a way out will be provided for you if you go to Him. And then what do? Once you're out, Paul says it as we read earlier, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Okay, so we start, pay attention that you are in danger. Good start. Then look for the way out when you're there. And then when you're out, get away from it. Flee from idolatry. Don't stay where you are. Don't stay close and in proximity to an idol that has captured your heart. Find a way to flee from that. And then finally, where would you flee to? I think Paul's showing us right here that we need to get close to Christ. Verse 16 and 17. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. We got to remember that we are one, not just together, but also with Christ. And we can turn to where we need to be in Him. When it talks about the cup and the bread here, it's speaking of communion. Now, not just the practice, the remembrance that we hold, which we need to and are commanded to, but this is the reality that we are in communion with Christ. Because remember who does the work. It's not us. It is God at work who will do this in us. So 4 steps. Take heed. Look for that way out. Flee idolatry and get close to Christ. That's the way to do it. And trust Him through it. So we got to break those idols. So ask God to reveal that to you. I would encourage you this week, take some time to ask God to reveal what idols you might have in your life. Sometimes they're well hidden. Good intentions hide a lot of idols. So go before God and ask about that. Lord, where might that be? A couple weeks ago, we were talking about rights. Ask God, is there a right in your life that you cling to, that you say, above any other, God, you can have everything, but you can't have this. I'm hanging on to this right no matter what you say. That might be an idol in your life. Last week, we talked about praying for one person that God could put in your life so that you could encourage, so that you can speak words of life to. If there was something in your life that was preventing you from doing that, something that was holding on, well, you might have an idol hiding behind there somewhere. So ask God to reveal that to you, and then take those steps. Remember you're in danger. Remember that you're in danger, but look for that way out. Look for the way out, and then flee to Christ. Paul ends us here on a bit of a warning. A bit of a warning here, because he then takes us back to these people in Israel. In verse 18, he says this, "Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then?" Now he takes it back to what he'd been talking about, eating food sacrificed to idols. That food offered to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He? And I think the clear answer is quite simple, no. No. Just in case we take this too lightly, we got to remember this, that those idols that may seem, innocuous, they don't seem like much at all. They're just a small little idol over there. They are demonic in our lives. Don't fool yourself into thinking that some small idol you might keep private, it's not that bad, because it is. You can't split on this. It's either all or nothing. A little idol, just a little idol, even a tiny one, that's allowed, unbroken in your life, it's going to equal failure and disqualification here. Now, as Paul will say, you'll get to heaven. This isn't a question of getting to heaven or not, if you come to faith in Jesus Christ. But you're not going to be effective right here. You're not going to be able to do the mission that He's called you to right here. And in the end, you're going to find that you've been fighting with God, contending with Him, because you can't join Him and fight Him at the same time, which is what we do when we hold on to idols. And if you try, you're going to end up like the Israelites in the desert. The Christian life, I think, in many ways can be compared to that experience of the Israelites. Paul does it here, and elsewhere we see it. You see, when we come to Christ, when we come to faith, it's like we're coming out of Egypt. God has pulled us out of slavery to sin into Egypt, and as we go through baptism and we begin those initial steps of the Christian faith, it's like going through the Red Sea. And then we find ourselves out there in the desert, for Mount Sinai. We might have a mountaintop experience as God does some initial changes in our life, and it's exciting, and there's a lot of light and noise, and everything's moving along, but eventually we get to the desert. out there where sometimes it's a grind. Sometimes we got to sort of stick with it. And there's always that call in our lives to go back to Egypt. Just go back, be like the world. It'd be so much easier if we could just be like the world. And sometimes we think that the Christian life is simply enduring the desert, just hanging out in the desert, suffering along with all the other sufferers, and one day we'll die, and then we'll go to the promised land. But the promised land isn't just for after death. The promised land is for right now. And what Paul's showing us here is what keeps us from the promised land, what kept these Israelites from it. Idols, putting things in our life before God. If we want to cross the Jordan, to the promised land, meaning we want to live a life of effectiveness where we know God is at work in our lives and we can see lives changed around us, we have to be able to give up those idols, put Him first, and trust Him as we walk through that Jordan. And then we can actually live in that promised land, live a life of actual victory in Christ. Now, if we choose not to, God will still be with you, like He was with those Israelites. He still provided them cover, He still provided them food, but they lived in the desert knowing that they'd never make it to that promised land in this life, never to enjoy those blessings. And that's what our life will be too. He'll love us and He'll care for us, but if we're not willing to take that step, we're not going to live with the blessing that we hope for, to see the life of Christ active in our life. So yeah, we do make idols. We're like, as one pastor said, little idol factories. We can churn these things out. So let's change that action, because we can by trusting Christ. And let us start breaking those idols. And when we do, the blessing that we see in our life as we cross over and we see what He can do, the blessing for us in this church will be incredible. And we will see lives changed. So examine your life. See where those idols are. And let's work together to break them, individually and as a church here.